All right, my name's Shannon, one of the pastors here. Glad to have you guys with us, and I'm going to lead us in prayer, and then we're going to dig into it. Oh, God, we thank you for this chance to worship you. Um, God, I just love the diversity of voices rising up. God, I thank you for the chance to worship you not only in song, but as we open up our eyes and open up our hearts to your word. God, I pray that you would go before us, that you would do the work within us that we can't do within ourselves. God, I pray that you would guide my words and make them better than what I can prepare. Lord, I pray that you just meet us here and that you would change us in our seats this morning for your glory. Amen. All right, so this morning we're continuing this series in Genesis called Faith in the Fog. And we're calling that because we're following Abraham and his story. He is referred to as the man of faith. And yet what we see in this story is just like in our own stories, there is a lot of faltering as he is kind of trying to navigate the fog of a fallen world. So that's where we get the title. But in the midst of this, we're not just tracing the story of Abraham. Even more than that, we're looking at God's redemptive story. So we're seeing how God is intervening in the world to rescue and redeem and recreate all of this into a new creation that can live under his blessing. And we also see that God blesses in order that we can be a blessing. So that's kind of where we're going in the whole series. Last week, what we saw is that Abraham's faith was tested by physical danger. This week, and he failed that test. This week, Abraham has to trust God for a satisfying life. And what I would say is that that's probably a lot harder. When we feel physically threatened, like it's easy to turn to God, it's easy to pray. When we're just kind of looking around in the world and saying, hey, what do I want? What's going to satisfy that sort of thing? It's actually harder to look to God. And that is what Abraham is struggling with and wrestling through this week. So again, last week failed the test, completely melt down in fear. Instead of trusting God to protect and provide, he took matters into his own hands. And what we saw is that Abraham, he became this guy who was lying and he was manipulating and he was putting his wife at risk in order to save his own skin. It's basically this gutless scene where Abraham and Sarah, they walk into Egypt. And Abraham starts to panic. He's like, I know my wife's really beautiful, and someone's going to want to kill me so they can have her. And so he just comes up with this whole scheme, and the scheme ends up with Sarah, his wife, being taken in to Pharaoh's harem. And again, it's all because Abraham is gutless, all because Abraham is faithless. He's completely failing the test, and yet God doesn't leave him to suffer the consequences of his own sin. God doesn't leave his wife to suffer under his terrible leadership. Instead, God redeems and God rescues, and God gets Sarah out of that situation before Pharaoh can lay a hand on her, and he sends both of them out of Egypt with more money in their pocket and more sheep in their flocks than they had when they went in. So basically, last week was a disaster in terms of Abraham's faith. But it was also an opportunity for his faith to be built because Abraham failed and God came through. So as we come into this week, Abraham is riding the spiritual high. And what we see is he's going to like retrace his past steps and he's just trying to get back to that life that he was living under God's blessing, walking by faith. So, maybe you look at your own Christian life and you've been walking with God for a while and there's just seasons that you can look at and say, man, my devotional life was great. I was dialed in. I wasn't struggling with temptation. I wasn't looking in different directions. No, I was just fixed on Jesus like we sing about. And so you're like, well, what can I do that I used to do in order to get back to that? And that's exactly what we see with Abraham this week. And so throughout the story that we get this week, Abraham's faith is not going to fail at all. Like he is going to be this model example walking by faith. And yet we're also going to get introduced to a secondary character, this guy named Lot, the nephew of Abraham, and he's going to be something of a dumpster fire. And Lot is coming into the story not because he's supplanting Abraham as a central character, but because he's going to be the foil. He's going to be the contrast that's going to help us to see Abraham's walking by faith and to see that even more brightly and vividly. So that's kind of some of what's going on from a literary sense in this passage, we're going to see that that Abraham's this guy who's walking by faith, and he's looking at the world through eyes of faith. And we're going to see that Lot, he looks at the world through ordinary eyes. And so when he looks at this physical world around him, he's just asking the same kind of ordinary questions that we ask, like, what can I do, and and what can I take, and what can I grab so that I can have more joy in my life? So if Lot is living now, then he'd probably be just like one of us who is tempted to live just like everyone around us, where we look at the world and we kind of look at our house and we say, well, if I had a little bit bigger house, or we look at our car and say, man, if I had a little bit nicer car, or we think about our career and our job situation and say, if I could climb one more rung, or we think about our relationships and say, well, if I could have this relationship, or if this one could be better, or something new, or whatever, then life would really be good. And that's just the kind of life that Lot is living, not extraordinarily bad, but just normal. The life of a fallen person living in a fallen world, hoping in the different good things in God's creation to really satisfy. But we're going to see that that's not the way that Abraham lives, and that's not the questions that Abraham is asking. Lot's we see that he ends up looking kind of outside on the fringe and just beyond God's revealed will to find the things that he thinks are really going to satisfy. Whereas Abraham is just this guy who, again, he is dialed in and he's like, God, whatever you have said, that's what I want. I can trust you. I don't need to manipulate the circumstances anymore. I don't need to strive. I don't need to make it happen. You've got me, and so I'm just free to worship you, and I'm free to be a blessing to everyone around me. And that's just the contrast that we're going to see in this passage, really coming down to this fundamental question of, will we believe that our greatest joy and satisfaction is going to come entirely within the revealed will of God? Or will we believe that we have to look just kind of beyond the edge of God's will, or just outside of God's will, in order to be satisfied? And Abraham's going to set this example of saying, no, it's right in the center. Just walk this way. So we're covering all of Genesis chapter 13. There's a ton going on from a literary perspective. In a lot of ways, this is the first of kind of a trilogy of stories where we see this contrast between Abraham and Lot. So it's kind of like, when you're reading Tolkien or whatnot, and maybe the action's a little slow in the first book, or like, no, actually what's really slow is The Hobbit, and there's all of these details, and you're like, well, why are these details here? And it's to set up what's to come. But again, in the midst of this story, we're gonna set up some contrast between the line that's going to walk by faith and receive God's blessing, and the divergent lines that are going to try to step outside of God's will and forfeit his blessing. And at its core, we're going to answer this question: do we believe that joy is ultimately found entirely within the revealed will of God? Or do we believe we need to look elsewhere? So that's where we're going. Digging in, Genesis chapter 13, starting with verse 1. It begins mentioning this guy named Abram, which is a little bit confusing because I keep on talking about Abraham. But for simplicity, in a little bit later story coming up, Abram's name gets changed to Abraham, Sarai gets changed to Sarah, and unless you're getting a master's degree in theology, you probably don't need to know the difference all that well, so I'm just talking about Abraham. So Abram, or Abraham, he went up from Egypt to the Negev. This is this desert kind of in the southern end of the promised land. And he went up there with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, when he had first built an altar. And there, Abraham called on the name of the Lord. So again, at this moment in the story, Abraham has just been rescued. Abraham has once again been redeemed, and he is riding a spiritual high. And we see him actually working backward through the previous itinerary. He's literally retracing his steps, trying to get back to the physical places where he saw God stirring his heart and working in his life. He's like, I want to be back there. I just want to be in the center of God's will. And when he gets back to this altar that he built in Bethel, it says that there, Abram called on the name of the Lord. What's it mean to call on the name of the Lord? I think there's some different theories out there. I think it just means that he prayed. And they could have just said he prayed. But they use this dramatic phrase, there he called on the name of the Lord, because this dramatic phrase, it's this literary marker that gets used several times in the book of Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible. And essentially, it's something that's to call the reader's attention to say, all right, the stars are back in alignment. God's people are walking by faith. They're leaning into him. They're praying to him. And God is going to move redemptively in response to their prayers. Okay, so it's this, pay attention, the story's about to get better. Because God's people are leaning into their God. So the first time we see this expression, it's back at the end of Genesis 4. And that's coming on the heels of the fall. So we have Adam and Eve fall into sin, and they're cursed, and they're cast out of the garden. And then we have their children. They're waiting for this promise to be fulfilled of the seed of the woman, this heir who's going to be the Redeemer, who's going to be what we later call the Messiah, who's going to be the one through whom God moves and makes everything good again. And so they have their firstborn son, Cain, and when he was born, there's this sense of anticipation of oh, God's going to redeem us through Cain, and Cain is anything but a redeemer. Cain is profoundly wicked. As the chapter unfolds, we see that Cain is jealous of his brother Abel, and so he murders his brother. And then as that chapter continues, we see the generations of Cain and all of his descendants and how they compound evil, and they just become more wicked than Cain who went before them. And the story gets darker and darker and darker as we trace the fallen line of Cain. And then all of a sudden, at the very end of chapter 4, it says that Adam lay with his wife, and Eve conceives, and they bring forth another son, a righteous son who will replace righteous Abel. We see this line of redemption coming. And again, if we're setting it to a movie soundtrack, this is when the trumpets start. This is when the whole ensemble comes in, and redemption is coming again. Okay, so we have Seth, and then Seth has a child, and it says, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. And again, it's the first time we get that expression. And then we see a bit of redemption, and then we see people fall into sin, the whole Noah account, destruction, all of these things, redemption, and then we see the people wandering into sin again, and the Tower of Babel, and things are going south, and God is scattering all the nations, and then God calls one man out of all the nations to form a new nation through whom he is going to bless the world. He says, I'm going to bless you, and you're going to be a blessing, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. And then the trumpets sound again. And late in Genesis chapter 12, we hear that once again, God's people, even if it's just this one man named Abraham, that they are again calling on the name of the Lord. And now we get it again. Abraham's fallen away. Abraham's come back. God's redeeming again. And Abraham just wants to get to this place where he can once again call on the name of the Lord. He's ready not just to be blessed, but to be a blessing, the means through which God will bless and redeem the world. So that's what's going on with Abraham. But what about Abraham's nephew? What about Lot? And again, from this moment forward, this chapter, the next chapter, and then we have kind of an interlude, and a few chapters later, Lot is going to be a significant character, not because of what he brings to the table himself, but because he is the foil, he is the contrast to Abraham. Okay, so thinking about foils, this is a character that's introduced in the story to be a contrast and to highlight the virtues of the central character, okay? And in a sense, in Scripture, like God is the central character, but we also have these leading men, and Abraham is one of them. So, what Lot does for Abraham is what Draco Malfoy does for Harry Potter, or it's what Darth Vader does for Luke Skywalker. In the gospel stories, it's what the Pharisees do for Jesus. Okay, or sometimes what the disciples do for Jesus. They are the bumblers. They are the fools. They are the people who keep getting it wrong. They're the dark fabric that makes the diamond sparkle more beautifully. Okay, and that's what Lot is doing in this story for Abraham. Verse 5. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abraham, he also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land, and again, there's a lot going on literarily, land, a reference to the promised land. It's going to keep on getting pounded. So they're moving around together, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were just so great that they were not able to stay together. They're just too many sheep, too many goats, too many cattle. Like where are we going to get enough water? Where are we going to get enough grass if we keep traveling so closely together? The promised land is getting crowded. Verse 7, and quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. They were also living in the land at the time. So we have all these different peoples competing for resources. And God has been blessing both Abraham and he's been blessing Lot because of Lot's association with Abraham. But again, there's just too much drinking of water, too much chomping of grass for them to travel together. Verse 8. So Abram said to Lot, hey, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked up. Literally, Lot lifted his eyes. And he saw that the whole plain of the Jordan River was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, meaning the Garden of Eden, or like the land of Egypt towards Zoar. And then the narrator gives this foreboding parenthetical note. He said, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. He set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan. That's the promised land. Well, Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So there's a ton going on here. There's a lot going on from a literary point of view. If we could read this in the original Hebrew, we'd be getting all of these textual cues where they use this word that they used in the previous story, and this word connects to that word, and a lot of that gets kind of flattened out when you translate it. But just to highlight some of the bunch that's going on here. First thing, Lot looks up. Literally, Lot lifts his eyes. And what we're going to see is that when Lot looks, when he lifts his eyes, he looks with physical eyes alone. He doesn't look with spiritual eyes. And what's going to come later is, as that phrase is repeated a little bit later in the story, it's going to set up this contrast where God calls Abraham to look with eyes of faith and to trust in God and to see how God is going to move and see how God is going to bless. But that's not how Lot thinks. Lot just looks up and he's like, okay, where is the best land? Because he gave me the opportunity to take the best land, and you better believe I'm getting the best thing for me. So he looks around and he says, that's where there's water. That's where the grass is green, literally greener than anything around. And I got to have that. And he chooses for himself. He chooses selfishly. That's the second thing we see, is that Lot's choosing selfishly, while Abraham, he is just blessing graciously. Again, Lot's trying to figure out, what can I grab? What can I get for me? And Abraham's like, what do I care? because I've got this God who has promised he's going to bless me. And a few weeks ago or a few months ago or a year ago or whenever he was in Egypt, I kind of doubted my God. Like he said he was going to bless me, but I wasn't sure, and things got hard, and I felt like I had to take matters into my own hands, and that went terribly, so I'm done with that. From now on, my God says he's going to bless me. I'm just going to take it. And he says he's given me this whole land. He's going to bless me in this whole land. So he's going to give it to my descendants. What do I care which way Lot goes and which way our goes? This is the land where God's going to bless me and everybody associated with me so that we can be a blessing to everyone else. Hey, look, this is my next chance to be a blessing to someone else. Lot, which land do you want? I don't even care. You can have it. My God's taking care of me. I'm just going to go worship him. You take whatever you want. It's yours. So because Abraham's heart is entirely fixed on this God who he trusts and this God who he loves and this God who he worships, because his heart isn't chasing after any other material thing in this world, and he's just free to be a blessing. And what a great way to live. Isn't it hard when we think of our money and we think of our time and we think of every resource that we have in our life as this limited resource that I got to hoard and I got to grab onto it so I can get mine? And if I give you a little bit of my time or a little bit of my mental energy, a little bit of my money, then it's going to be less for me. I'm going to be more tired. I don't know. That's a miserable way to live. And that's the way most of us are tempted to live every day. Abraham's like, God has got me. I can trust him. So I'm just here to bless you. What do you need? What do you even think you need? What do you want? I'm here. I'm like the ATM. Just take it. Because just like an ATM, I don't really know how it works and how the money gets back there, but it's back the next day. Like my God is taking care of me, and I'm convinced of it. So let's just go forward that way. Third thing we see is that Lot sets out towards the east, which sounds like a stupid point. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And from a life application point of view to the modern day, it doesn't have much to do with anything. Like, if you're trying to decide whether to buy this house or that house, don't make the primary decision whether it's east or west. If you want to think Ann Arbor or Ipsy, you can contextualize, you can do whatever. But there's nothing mystically significant about the west versus the east. And yet at this point in the story, from a literary point of view, again, this is where the foreboding music comes on. And I don't know enough about music to know what instruments we're using. What is it? What's a foreboding instrument? Like a tuba? I don't know. Something low, something slow, something bad. Sorry if you're a tuba player. I really don't even know what it sounds like. I just know it's big. Okay? But when it says that Lot set out towards the east, what brings to mind, it takes the reader back to the garden. And again, when we read a story like this, we tend to read the book of Genesis as part of like a one-year plan or something like that. So we're reading 1 or 2, maybe 3 chapters in a day, and then we're getting on with our day, and we're like losing sight of the story. But the original audience, they're hearing this as a story. They're probably gathering around for a couple hours outside, and they're hearing somebody read this aloud. And so all the connections between the different chapters, all the allusions, all the phrases and whatnot, they really pop. So when Lot chooses to go east, the original audience, their mind, it goes back to the garden, because when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, they were kicked out to the east. And it says God set up this angel, this seraphim or whatever, and he's going to guard the eastern edge of the garden with these flashing swords and keep anyone from coming back in. And then in the next chapter, we get Cain, and Cain goes to live in the land of Nod, to the east of Eden. I think it's Steinbeck or somebody that pulls on that phrase and uses that title. East of Eden is not a good thing. That's life in a fallen world. I want to say in Genesis, I guess it's chapter 10, 11, whatever, when we get into the Tower of Babel, the people who are supposed to scatter over all the earth in defiance to God, they find a nice plain that's in the east, and they say, oh, this looks like a place to live. Let's go build a city there. Let's gather there. God said to scatter, but we're going to gather. God said to fill the earth with his glory, but no, we're going to build a tower. We're going to build a monument for our glory, and we're going to do it in the east. Okay? East does not go well at this point in the story. That's just part of what's going on from a narrative point of view. Choosing east is not going to end well. Fourth thing we see in this, Abraham is staying in the land. And again, this is an allusion to the promised land. But Lot is headed towards the city and towards a very wicked city. Scholars debate exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah was. Because what we see a few chapters later is that God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah completely. And so, like, archaeologically, it's like, oh, I don't even know. So, like, there's lots of different theories, but I think the prevailing theories, the best ideas are that it's someplace to the south. Some think that God pummeled it so deeply that it ends up at the bottom of the southern end of the Dead Sea. Other people think, yeah, it's a little bit to the southeast. One way or another, wherever Sodom and Gomorrah were, they were at least at the very edge of the promised land. So wherever Abraham and Lot are having this conversation, they're within the promised land, and he looks to the east, and he starts going that way. And that edge of the promised land is good, but he's going beyond the edge. Okay, he's going at least to the very edge, probably beyond the edge. And at least metaphorically, what's going on there is that Abraham, he's content within the land of God's promise. He's saying, this is where God said he's going to bless. This is where I want to be. But Lot is literally looking for greener pasture. He's looking beyond the edge of that. He's probably looking just across that line. Some of the geographic descriptions, it gives like the boundaries, and it says stretching to the east towards Sodom, but it doesn't say like including Sodom. Okay? So he's looking just across that line, and he's saying, man, if I'm going to really live, if life is going to be good, I can't be with Abraham just like, within the bounds of what God said. I need to go just outside those boundaries. That's where I'm going to find life. And again, that's one of the major motifs. That's one of the major ideas or metaphors for kind of what's going on in this whole chapter. And what I want us to understand about this is that by going just outside the bounds of God's revealed will, he's stepping into a place of temptation. It says it was a wicked city. So Lot's putting himself in the situation where every day he's going to be flirting with wickedness and flirting with destruction. And I don't want you to hear this and say, I don't want to live among wicked people. Okay? One, because you are kind of wicked, no offense, I am too. But two, because God has actually called us to live among the worst and the wicked and the weak. God has called us to go on mission to bring the good news of his life and death and resurrection to all people. Okay? So we are a people who are sent into the worst places, into the dangerous places, into even the spiritually dangerous places to bring the good news of the gospel. But that is not why Lot is going. Lot's not thinking in his head, man, there's a lot of godless people over here, and they need to hear about my God and Abraham's God. No, they're like, Abraham's doing this thing with God, and I see good land. I see an investment opportunity, and I want to get in early, and it's going to go well for me if I do. If he were going on mission, it would be this beautiful thing. That is not what he's doing. He's going there selfishly because he hopes to find a better life there than he believes that he can find within the land of God's blessing. So Lot looks up, and it says he sees a land that looked like the Garden of Eden. It reminded him of the stories he'd heard of the Garden of Eden, but he doesn't realize that he's just like Eve being tempted by the forbidden fruit. But again, if you're getting the whole story together and you're just hearing the narrative all in one sitting, those are the connections that you're going to make. The connections are there in the geography, in the vocabulary, in everything, to bring the reader's mind back to the reality that Lot is in the place of Eve. Lot is being tempted by the forbidden fruit. It is not going to go well for him. And we're not going to see all the consequences unfold in this chapter, but in the next chapter, Lot and his family, they're going to be prisoners of war. He's like, I'm going to go there and get rich, and pretty soon everything they have is going to be taken by other people who also look at that land and say, oh, I'm going to go there and get rich. I'm going to pillage. I'm going to take. And by the end of that chapter, God is going to use Abraham to redeem Lot and to rescue Lot and to get everything back together. But Lot is not going to learn his lesson. And we're going to kind of step out of the Abraham-Lot narrative, but then several chapters later, I think it's chapter 19, Lot comes back into the story. And what we see is that it's not just that it was a dangerous place physically, no, it was a dangerous place spiritually. Because Lot, he went to live with these wicked people, and what we're going to find is that God is eventually going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because their wickedness just became so great. And again, through Abraham, God is going to rescue Lot. But he's not going to come out unscathed. He's going to lose his wife in that whole situation. His wife is going to die. And his daughters are going to flee with him. But when they flee the mountains, what we're going to see is that they have been so corrupted by the values and the worldview of the people of Sodom that Lot's daughters actually get him drunk and rape him. Because they believe that that is going to be the path to life. Because they have been so twisted by the wickedness that surrounded them as their family has sought the good life by the same values of the surrounding culture. So these are the warnings that are being given to us. To say, guys, I know you think that life is found somewhere outside the revealed will of God. That you need to grab a hold of what you can. You need to take it. You need to make it happen. But that is not where you find the good life. That is not where you find joy. That is not where you find satisfaction. So it's just this warning, this rhetorical question to us again and again. Where are you looking for joy? Where are you looking for satisfaction? Are you looking to God and His good gifts that He promises to you, or are you looking for things that you can grab with your two hands? To the married men and women in the room, are you looking for joy in the spouse that God gave you? Or are you looking to pornography and romance novels and whatever we have on that same gradient for that same purpose that's so much more socially acceptable than the extremes? And saying, no, I want to live in a fantasy world, whether in the things that I look at or the things that I read or the things that I watch or the thoughts that go through my own mind, because I just think that there's got to be something better for me than what God has given me in this spouse. Are we looking for joy and satisfaction within the revealed will of God or someplace outside of it? To the single people in the room, what does God say about singleness? He says it's a gift. He says it's something God has given to bless. He also says that marriage is a gift and a good thing. But in this season of singleness, are we looking for joy and satisfaction and blessing within exactly what God has given us? Or are we waking up every morning and saying in our heart, oh, if I could just be married, or if I could have a new relationship, or date somebody who's interesting, then life would really be good. You're not going to get much blessing out of this gift of singleness if you're constantly looking outside of that gift and saying, no, life is found someplace else. Again, we could look at this in 1,000 different ways. Our culture is constantly telling us we need something bigger, something better, something more. But God is saying, hey, I want to invite you to trust me. Because I am the God who gives graciously. I am the God who gives lavishly. And frankly, I give you more than you need. I think every single one of us, we daily face the temptation to say, well, that sounds like a good spiritual principle, but surely I'm the exception to the rule. Like I see the fools around me, the fools in my church, the fools in my family, whatever, and I'm like, yeah, they're always chasing after stupid stuff and it never ends well. But the thing that I want, no, that's really good. I want a degree. I want a job. I just want a better marriage. I want, whatever. I want good things. And so I'm going to fixate on the good things that I know that I deserve and that I need and whatever. Again, the story is trying to get us to say, no, you're Eve. You're Lot. I'm Lot. I'm the fool. I have been the fool as I was writing this sermon. Like, this week has been full of irony because I'm writing this stuff like, oh, I did it again. Oh, my heart is just longing for these things that God has not set before me because I believe so deeply to my core that that's where life is. And it's been a beautiful week of rebuke for me. To just say, Shannon, you're being a fool again. That's not where life is. Life is in your God. Just look to Him and trust in Him and hope in Him and stop chasing after all this stupid stuff. Amen? That's the invitation that we find. This warning, this begging of saying, please don't look for joy outside of God's will because no joy will be found there. Instead, in the words of James, desire will conceive and give birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, will give birth to death. So Lot is on this dangerous path that's going to end really, really, really badly. We don't see the end until several chapters later. But Abraham, he is leaning into his Lord. And Abraham, he is free to worship God because he's not chasing after something else. Abraham can give his whole heart to God because his heart isn't wrapped up in some other idol. And Abraham can be this amazing conduit of blessing because he isn't trying to grab or hold on to anything else for himself. He's just like, no, my God's got me. I'm going to bless you. But really where this whole passage ends with this renewal of promise and this scene of worship. Verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, He says, lift up your eyes. And again, this is this rhetorical calling back. Like Lot's just looking at the physical things that he can see. But God is saying to Abraham, okay, I want you to open up your eyes and see something bigger. Lift up your eyes from where you are and look to the north and the south, to the east and the west, all the land that you see. Man, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to your offspring forever. And this is just a renewal of the promise that's already given. But at this point in the story, Abraham still doesn't have an heir, and his closest family member, Lot, some that think, oh, maybe he would be the heir. No, Lot's going off, and Lot's being a fool. And so from a fulfillment of the promise point of view, Abraham's even further behind. Like, who's the heir going to be? We have no idea. We're just getting older, and there's no heir to come. But what does God say? He says, I'm giving this land to you and to your offspring forever. And then he keys in on this offspring because this is the dilemma. This is the unresolved tension still in the story. And God has not revealed how he's going to do this physically, but he's calling Abraham again to look with eyes of faith. And he's doubling down and saying, here's the deal about your offspring. Verse 16, I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. You're looking for one son. I'm talking multitudes here. He says, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. So he reiterates his promise to make Abram into a great nation. And he makes the promise even bigger this time so that there's even greater potential to bless others. But for now, the focus is simply on worshiping God and trusting God, who just continues to be so gracious to him. Verse 17, God continues to speak to Abraham saying, go, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. Again, the passage ends in worship. Lot's on this dangerous path that's going to end really badly, but Abraham is leaning into his Lord. Abraham is free to worship God because he's not chasing after something else. Abraham can give his whole heart to God because his heart isn't wrapped up in an idol. Abraham can be this wonderful conduit of blessing because he isn't seeking to grab and hold anything for himself. And man, I am praying this week for your hearts and for my heart that we would be the same. That we would be the people who are just enamored with our God instead of enamored with the good things in his creation. That we would be the people who are fixed on him and are worshiping him rather than offering our worship to the things that we can grab with our hands. I pray that we would be the people who can overflow as conduits of blessing to others because there's nothing that we're trying to hoard. There's nothing that we think we need to hang on to because we have a God who gives what we need and more. Amen? All right, let's pray to that end. God, I pray that we might be a people who live under your blessing and walk by faith. God, I pray that we would be a people who just don't get hung up in the silly things that everyone around us gets hung up on. God, I pray that we would be a people who are content and who believe that you've given us a surplus that we can bless others. God, I pray that we would be a people who are generous with our money because we trust you to provide for our needs. I pray that we would be a people who are generous with our time because we know that every breath that we have is a gift of your grace. I pray that we would be a people who would be generous with our mental and emotional energy. That we would be a people who are just eager to pour ourselves out because we believe that you are the one who refreshes and that you are the one who gives joy and that you are the one who satisfies. And God, I just pray this week that you would supernaturally move so that we find you more joyful and we find you more satisfying, that you would drive these truths into our heart, not just intellectually or theologically, but that we would experience these truths this week for your glory. Amen.